It's 3 a.m. on a frozen Korean hillside in January 1952. The temperature is 20 degrees below zero. You're huddled in a muddy hole in the ground, your rifle so cold it could freeze to your hands. The enemy is just 50 yards away, close enough that you can hear them coughing. Welcome to the Korean War, the conflict they called the Forgotten War before it was even over. While World War II gets the movies and Vietnam gets the documentaries, Korea sits in the shadows. But for 3 brutal years, from 1950 to 1953, this peninsula became a frozen hell where young men from around the world learned what it meant to live underground. Today, we're going into those trenches. We're going to experience what it was really like to fight a war that nobody wanted to win, nobody knew how to end, and everybody tried to forget. To understand why Korea became a trench war, you need to understand how it started, because it began as anything but. June 25th, 1950, North Korean forces, backed by Soviet tanks and artillery, smashed across the 38th parallel. This wasn't supposed to be World War III, but it sure looked like it. In just 3 days, Seoul fell. American and South Korean forces found themselves in full retreat, pushed all the way down to a tiny perimeter around the port city of Busan. But then came one of the most audacious military moves in history: General Douglas MacArthur's amphibious landing at Incheon in September 1950. Suddenly, the war flipped. North Korean forces collapsed and UN troops raced north, some reaching almost to the Chinese border. That's when everything changed. On November 1st, 1950, Chinese volunteers, really the People's Liberation Army in disguise, hit UN forces like a sledgehammer. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers poured across the Yalu River, armed with simple weapons but fighting with terrifying human wave tactics. You'd hear the bugles first, then you'd see them coming up the hill, thousands of them, and they just kept coming. You'd mow down the first wave, then the second, but there was always a third. By January 1951, UN forces were retreating again, back below Seoul. The war had become a bloody stalemate. Neither side could decisively defeat the other, but neither could afford to lose. And that's when both armies started digging. Spring 1951 marked the beginning of what would become the longest sustained trench warfare since World War I. But these weren't the neat, organized trenches you might imagine from movies about the Western Front. This was improvised, desperate, and constantly evolving. The terrain itself was brutal. Korea is mostly mountains and hills covered in rock-hard clay that turned to soup when it rained and froze solid in winter. Digging a foxhole was backbreaking work. Digging a trench system was nearly impossible. You'd carry at least 100 rounds of ammunition, plus grenades. Hand grenades were crucial in trench warfare. Sometimes the enemy was so close that you couldn't use your rifle effectively. But your most important tool, your entrenching shovel. This simple piece of equipment was literally the difference between life and death. You used it to dig your position deeper, to repair damage from artillery, to build latrines, and yes, sometimes as a weapon in close combat. Life in a Korean trench followed a rhythm dictated by survival and the enemy's artillery schedule. Dawn and dusk were stand-to times, when attacks were most likely. Every man would be at his position, weapon ready, watching the approaches. The rest of the day was divided between observation duty, improvement of positions, and trying to stay alive. You'd have maybe 2 hours on watch, then 4 hours off. But off didn't mean rest. It meant digging, cleaning weapons, writing letters if you had paper, or just trying to stay warm. Mail call was a highlight, when it came. Letters from home were lifelines to a world that seemed impossibly far away. Some guys would read the same letter dozens of times until the paper fell apart. Food was usually sea rations, canned meals that were nutritious but monotonous. Beef and beans, ham and eggs, chicken and vegetables, served cold more often than hot. Hot coffee was a luxury that required either a break in the fighting or exceptional bravery by supply personnel. If you had to pick the worst enemy in Korea, it wouldn't be the Chinese or North Koreans. It would be winter. Korean winters are legendary for their brutality, and 1950 to 1951 was one of the coldest on record. Temperatures regularly dropped to 20 or 30 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. At those temperatures, metal becomes brittle, Machinery fails and human beings can die in minutes without proper protection. Frostbite was epidemic. Men would wake up and their feet would be white as snow, with no feeling at all. Some weeks saw more casualties from cold than from enemy action. In the trenches, everything froze. Water froze in canteens. Food froze solid. Weapons froze and wouldn't fire. The ground froze so hard that digging was impossible. Repairs to damaged positions had to wait for warmer weather. Staying warm became an obsession. Soldiers would buddy up in sleeping bags, sharing body heat. They'd burn anything that would burn. Ammunition boxes, paper, even pieces of their wooden bunkers when desperation set in. Some positions had small oil-burning stoves, but these were dangerous in enclosed spaces and drew enemy attention. The cold killed in subtle ways too. It slowed reflexes, clouded judgment, and sapped the will to fight. Men who had survived intense combat would simply give up when faced with another frozen night. Living underground for months created health problems that went far beyond enemy bullets. Trench foot, the same condition that plagued World War I soldiers, was endemic. Feet constantly wet and cold would develop painful infected sores. In severe cases, toes and even entire feet had to be amputated. The smell was unbearable. Men couldn't change their socks for weeks. Their feet would literally rot inside their boots. Dysentery was common, caused by contaminated water and poor sanitation. Imagine having severe diarrhea while living in a hole in the ground under enemy observation in sub-zero temperatures. Lice and rats were constant companions. The lice carried disease and made sleeping impossible with their constant itching. The rats were often as big as cats, bold enough to steal food from sleeping soldiers, and numerous enough to make walking through communication trenches at night a disgusting ordeal. But perhaps the worst enemy was one that left no visible wounds: the constant stress of trench warfare. Unlike mobile warfare, where battles have clear beginnings and endings, trench warfare was a continuous state of tension. You were never truly safe, never truly off duty, never able to fully relax. They called it combat fatigue then. Today we'd recognize it as PTSD. Men who had fought bravely for months would suddenly break down crying, or become catatonic, or start talking to people who weren't there. The randomness of artillery was particularly devastating psychologically. You could do everything right, keep your head down, follow orders, maintain your position, and still die instantly from a shell that fell at random. The worst part wasn't the fighting, it was the waiting. You'd sit in that hole for days knowing they were out there, knowing they could see you, waiting for something to happen. Your nerves would just fray. Sleep became elusive. Every sound could be an infiltrator. Every distant explosion could be the beginning of an attack. Men would go days without real sleep, existing in a twilight state of exhausted alertness. The trench lines weren't always quiet. Both sides conducted constant raids and patrols, trying to gather intelligence, capture prisoners, or simply keep the enemy on edge. Night patrols were terrifying affairs. Small groups of soldiers would crawl out of their trenches after dark, armed with knives, grenades, and automatic weapons, trying to reach enemy positions without being detected. You'd blacken your face, take off anything that might make noise. Then you'd crawl on your belly through the mud and snow, sometimes for hours, just to get close enough to see what they were doing. These patrols often ended in vicious close-quarters combat, fighting with knives and fists in shell holes and abandoned bunkers, where the difference between friend and enemy was measured in split seconds and muzzle flashes. Capturing prisoners was a priority because interrogation was often the only way to learn about enemy plans. But taking a prisoner alive in the middle of a firefight, then getting him back to your own lines, required skill and luck in equal measure. Occasionally, the stalemate would break into major battles that resembled the Western Front of World War I more than the mobile warfare Korea had started as. Take Heartbreak Ridge in October 1951. The 2nd Infantry Division attacked heavily fortified North Korean positions on a series of hills. What was supposed to be a quick operation turned into a month-long meat grinder. The attack began with massive artillery barrages, thousands of shells falling on enemy positions. Then waves of infantry would go over the top, just like in 1916, charging across open ground toward enemy trenches. You'd wait for the artillery to lift, then the whistle would blow and you'd go. Running uphill through the mud toward machine guns and mortars. Half your unit would be down before you got halfway. The North Koreans and Chinese were dug in deep, with interlocking fields of fire and pre-registered artillery targets. They would let the first wave pass, then emerge from hidden bunkers to attack from behind while hitting the second wave from the front. Ground would be won and lost repeatedly. Hills would change hands 3 or 4 times in a single day. Men would fight hand-to-hand in trenches filled with bodies, using bayonets, rifle butts, and anything else they could find. The battles for places with names like Bloody Ridge, Heartbreak Ridge, Pork Chop Hill, and Old Baldy cost thousands of casualties for gains measured in yards. Heartbreak Ridge alone cost the 2nd Infantry Division 3,700 casualties, dead, wounded, and missing. The hill they finally captured was so damaged by artillery that its shape had literally changed. And after all that sacrifice, the strategic situation remained essentially unchanged. The front lines barely moved. Both sides returned to their trenches, and the grinding stalemate continued. They'd take that hill, and the enemy would take it back. Then they'd take it again, and the enemy would take it back again. After a while, soldiers started wondering what the point was. What were they dying for? The men in the trenches couldn't survive without a massive support network stretching back to ports in Japan and supply depots in the United States. Every bullet, every can of food, every medical bandage had to be carried up treacherous mountain paths, often under enemy fire. Korean Service Corps workers, locals hired to carry supplies, became unsung heroes of the war. These men and women would carry 80-pound loads up mountains that vehicles couldn't climb, through snow and mud and enemy artillery, for wages that barely kept their families alive. Medical personnel performed miracles in conditions that would challenge modern hospitals. The Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, MASH, became famous later through the TV show. But the reality was far grimmer than any comedy could portray. Surgeons would operate by candlelight in tents while artillery shook the ground. They'd work 20-hour shifts, saving lives with primitive equipment and determination. The wounded would arrive covered in mud and ice, often with injuries so severe that in any previous war, they would have been written off as hopeless. Korea was truly a United Nations war, with forces from 16 different countries fighting alongside American and South Korean troops. British soldiers from the Gloucestershire Regiment made a legendary last stand at the Battle of Imjin River. Turkish troops earned a reputation for fierce fighting that impressed even veteran American units. Each nation brought its own tactics, equipment, and fighting style. The Canadians were known for their professionalism and steady reliability. The Filipinos fought with a ferocity that surprised everyone who underestimated them. The Thai forces adapted quickly to mountain warfare, despite coming from a tropical climate, but they all shared the same miserable conditions in the trenches. Cold, mud, and enemy fire made equals of everyone. While men died in the trenches, diplomats sat in comfortable rooms at Panmunjom, arguing over the shape of the conference table. The peace talks began in July 1951 and dragged on for 2 years with no real progress. The fighting continued because neither side was willing to make the concessions necessary for peace. North Korea and China wanted all foreign troops out of Korea. The UN wanted guarantees that North Korea wouldn't attack again. Neither side would budge. So the war became an exercise in controlled violence. Both sides would fight for tactically meaningless hills, not because the hills mattered, but because showing weakness at the negotiating table might cost them at the peace talks. Men died for Pork Chop Hill not because Pork Chop Hill was strategically important, but because abandoning it might send the wrong signal to the communists at Panmunjom. On July 27, 1953, the guns finally fell silent. But this wasn't peace. It was just a ceasefire. The Korean Armistice Agreement was supposed to be a temporary measure, leading to a permanent peace treaty. That treaty was never signed. Technically, North and South Korea are still at war today, more than 70 years later. The demilitarized zone that separates North and South Korea follows almost exactly the same line as the trenches from 1953. In some places, you can still see the old bunkers and firing positions, now overgrown with vegetation, but still recognizable to anyone who understands what to look for. The numbers are staggering. American casualties: 36,574 dead, 103,284 wounded. South Korean military casualties: over 400,000. Chinese and North Korean casualties: estimates range from 600,000 to over 1 million. Civilian casualties were even worse. Millions of Koreans died, fled their homes, or simply disappeared. Entire cities were reduced to rubble. Families were separated by the new border and have never been reunited. For the men who fought in the trenches and survived, coming home meant dealing with a nation that had already moved on. Korea was overshadowed by World War II and later by Vietnam. It became the forgotten war, while the men who fought it were still young. But look at South Korea today. Seoul is one of the world's great cities, a hub of technology and culture. The country that was devastated in 1953 became an economic miracle, a thriving democracy, a global leader in innovation. That transformation was built on the foundation of those trenches. The men who froze in the mud on Heartbreak Ridge and Porkchop Hill didn't just fight for abstract principles, they fought for the future of an entire people. The Korean War veterans are in their 90s now, if they're still alive. Their war may have been forgotten by history, but its consequences shape the world we live in today. The Cold War, the division of Korea, the American role in Asia, all of it traces back to those frozen trenches and the men who held them. They called it the Forgotten War, but the men who fought it deserve to be remembered, not just as statistics or symbols, but as human beings who endured unimaginable hardships with courage, humor, and an unbreakable bond with the men beside them in the trenches. The war nobody talks about deserves to be talked about, because the men who fought it, American, British, Turkish, Filipino, Canadian, Australian, and all the others, they were the best of us in the worst of times, and they held the line.